I thought loneliness was something that happened to people who were doing adulthood wrong, that it was the condition of the isolated, the antisocial, the people who had somehow failed to build the connections that everyone else was building naturally and effortlessly. I was none of those things. I was social and warm and genuinely interested in people. And I had friends, real ones, people I loved and who loved me back. I did not expect to spend significant portions of my 20s and 30s feeling profoundly alone. Nobody told me that adult loneliness is a different animal from the loneliness of childhood or adolescence. When you are young and lonely, the solution is structural. You are placed in schools and activities and environments where proximity creates connection almost automatically, where friendships form through repetition and shared experience, and the simple fact of being in the same place at the same time every day. You do not have to engineer the conditions for closeness. The conditions are engineered for you. Adulthood removes the engineering. You leave the institution, the school, the college, the first job where everyone was new together, and suddenly, the mechanism that was producing connection disappears, and you're left with the connections you built, and the understanding that building new ones now requires a level of deliberate effort that feels, in comparison to how easy it used to be, almost absurd. You have to choose to pursue people. You have to extend invitations that might not be reciprocated. You have to be willing to be the one who tries repeatedly, without the guarantee of effortless return. I moved to a new city at 29 for a job opportunity that was genuinely good and that I do not regret. What I was not prepared for was how long it would take to build a real social world in that city. Not acquaintances, not colleagues I liked, but the kind of friends who know the full context of your life and whose presence makes things feel less large. It took 4 years. 4 years of effort that often felt disproportionate to the results. Of dinner parties where connections that seemed promising led nowhere. Of friendships that formed quickly and then dissolved when people moved or changed, or simply turned out to have less in common with me than the initial warmth had suggested. There were Saturday evenings in those 4 years that I sat in my apartment in a city of millions of people and felt a loneliness so specific and so concrete that it was almost physical. I did not tell anyone about it because it felt like an admission of something, of failure or of need, or of the embarrassing gap between the life I had in theory and the life I had in practice. I performed fine. Internally, I was lonely in a way I had no framework for. What helped was not a single friendship or a single connection, but the accumulation of small, persistent efforts over time. A book club I almost didn't join, a colleague I invited to dinner twice before she said yes, a neighbor I talked to in the hallway for 6 months before either of us suggested getting coffee. Adult friendships are built in increments, and the increments feel insufficient until suddenly you look up and realize you are no longer lonely. And you cannot point to a single moment when it changed because it changed the way all slow things change. Too gradually to notice until it is already done. What I learned: adult loneliness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a structural feature of a life stage that nobody prepares you for adequately. The institution is gone, and the mechanism is gone, and you have to build the connections yourself, deliberately and patiently, in a culture that does not make this easy and does not like to admit how hard it is. You are not the only one sitting in your apartment on a Saturday night feeling this. The loneliness is almost universal. It is just almost universally private.
I spent most of my childhood believing my father knew what he was doing, not in a worshipful way. He was not a particularly warm or demonstrative man, and I had no illusions about his perfection. But underneath the specific frustrations of our relationship, there was a baseline assumption I carried without ever examining it, the assumption that adults in general, and parents in particular, were operating from a position of genuine competence and understanding, that they had access to some framework for navigating life that I would eventually receive, some transfer of knowledge that happened when you crossed from one side to the other. I was 26 when I first understood that my father had been figuring it out as he went, the same as everyone else. The conversation that cracked it open was not dramatic. We were sitting in his kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of ordinary visit that had become easier as I got older, and the specific friction of adolescence had softened into something more like two adults who shared a history. He was talking about a decision he had made when I was around 10, a career change that had disrupted our family financially for several years, and that I had experienced as a period of tension and uncertainty. He was talking about it in the past tense, with the distance of 20 years, and what he said was, "I genuinely did not know if it was going to work. I was terrified for most of it. I just didn't let you see that." I sat with that for a long time after I drove home. The man I had experienced as solid during that period, not warm, not communicative, but solid, a fixed point, had been terrified the whole time. He had not known what he was doing. He had made a decision with incomplete information, in conditions of genuine uncertainty, hoping it would work in the way that people hope when hoping is all they have. And he had maintained a surface of competence because he believed, probably correctly, that a 10-year-old needed a surface of competence more than he needed honesty about his father's fear. The recalibration that followed was significant. I began to understand, in a way that I had known intellectually, but not felt fully, that nobody is issued the framework I had been waiting for, that adulthood is not a destination where things become clear, but an ongoing condition of making decisions without sufficient information and living with the results, that the people I had understood as knowing what they were doing had simply been doing it, with fear, with uncertainty, with the same improvisation I was applying to my own life and privately ashamed of. I became more compassionate toward my father in the years after that conversation, not because he had been perfect. He had not been, and there were real things between us that needed real honesty, but because understanding him as a person who had been doing his best, with what he had changed the terms of my relationship to him in a way that was better for both of us, and I became more compassionate toward myself. The shame I had been carrying about not having things figured out, about being 26 and uncertain, 30 and still improvising, 35 and still not in possession of the framework, began to lose its grip when I understood that the framework was never coming. Everyone is improvising. The ones who look like they aren't are just better at the surface of competence than they are at admitting what's underneath it. What I learned, your parents were people before they were your parents, and they remained people throughout. The competence you perceived in them was partly real and partly performed, and partly the natural consequence of seeing them from the outside. Growing up means revising your understanding of the adults who raised you from authority figures into human beings, fallible, uncertain, doing their best with incomplete information. That revision is not a loss. It is eventually a kind of freedom.
I think I believed, without articulating the belief, that my body would reach some point of completion and stay there. That the changes of adolescence would finish, and I would arrive at a physical self that was essentially stable, requiring maintenance, but not fundamental revision. Nobody told me that the body keeps changing throughout a life, not just aging in the ways we understand aging, but shifting and adjusting and surprising you in ways that require ongoing negotiation with a self you thought you knew. My 30s arrived differently than I'd expected them to. The energy that had been available to me in my 20s, the ability to sleep 5 hours and function, to eat carelessly without consequence, to push my body through a demanding week and recover over a single weekend, began to operate on different terms. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently enough that I could not pretend the terms had not changed. I needed more sleep to feel like myself. Recovery took longer. The body that had largely done what I asked of it without requiring much in return was now asking for something back. I responded to this the way I respond to most things, with research and effort and a plan. I read about nutrition and sleep and hormones and the particular physiology of women in their 30s, with the same thoroughness I brought to professional problems. I made changes. Some of them helped. But what I was slower to accept was that the changes were not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accommodated, and that accommodation required a different relationship to my body than the one I had been in, which was, if I am honest, primarily instrumental. My body had been the vehicle through which I did everything else, and I had not thought of it as something requiring genuine care and attention until it began insisting on it. The more significant shift came in how I related to my appearance. I had been reasonably comfortable in my body for most of my adult life, not without the ordinary self-criticism that most women carry, but without the active dissatisfaction that I know many people experience. And then I began to look different in the specific ways that time produces, and I discovered that I had assumptions about my own aging that I had never examined, assumptions built out of a culture that is deeply ambivalent about women getting older and that had shaped my expectations in ways I hadn't noticed until they were being tested. I did not handle this perfectly. I went through a period of resistance, not dramatic, not visible to most people but real, where I related to the changes as things to be reversed rather than facts to be integrated. I spent money on things that promised reversal and felt, afterward, not better but slightly ashamed of the expenditure, of having paid for the privilege of pretending that the arrow was not pointing in the direction it was pointing. What moved me out of resistance was not a single insight, but a gradual accumulation of encounters with women older than me who wore their age with a ease I found genuinely beautiful, not because they had achieved some perfect acceptance or because they were indifferent to how they looked, but because they seemed to have negotiated a working relationship with their changing bodies that was honest and spacious and not at war with itself. What I learned: your body is not a fixed object that you maintain. It is a living system that changes throughout your life, and your relationship to it requires the same ongoing attention and renegotiation that any important relationship requires. The changes are not failures. The body asking for more is not a betrayal. And the culture that teaches you to resist your own aging rather than inhabit it is not serving your interests. It is serving its own. Make peace with the body you are in now, not the one you had before or the one you imagine having if you tried harder. This one is the one you have. It deserves better than a relationship defined by management and resistance.
I spent my early 20s waiting to feel like myself. I assumed that at some point, after enough experience, enough success, enough living, something would click into place, and I would know who I was in the solid, stable way that adults seem to know. I looked at older people and interpreted their apparent certainty as evidence that they had arrived somewhere I had not yet reached. I treated my own uncertainty as a temporary condition, a symptom of being young and unfinished that would resolve itself with time. Nobody told me that the certainty I was observing from the outside was, in many cases, not what it looked like. Nobody told me that identity is not something that arrives, but something that is continuously built, revised, and rebuilt, not just in youth, but throughout a life, in response to everything that happens to you and everything you choose. My 20s were defined by trying on versions of myself with a frequency that I found exhausting and that I was embarrassed by, as if the trying itself was evidence of a deficiency. I changed careers once and directions twice. I moved cities. I entered and left relationships and friendships that were partially about connection and partially about exploring what kind of person I was in relation to different kinds of people. I had strong opinions that I later revised and then revised again. I could not have told you, at 25, what I actually believed about the things that mattered, because I was still in the middle of finding out. I was 31 when I had a conversation with a man I admired professionally, someone in his late 50s who had built something significant and who carried himself with the ease of someone who had found his terms with the world. I asked him, in the way you ask people you trust things you wouldn't ask otherwise, whether he had always known who he was or whether there had been a period of uncertainty. He laughed, not unkindly, and said the uncertainty never fully went away, that he still revised his understanding of himself regularly, that he simply cared less about the revision than he once had, that he had made peace with being a work in progress rather than a finished thing. That reframe, from deficiency to ongoing process, was more useful to me than anything I had encountered in the years of self-examination that had preceded it. I had been treating my lack of certainty as something to be resolved rather than as the natural condition of a person who is paying attention. The people who seem most certain are not the ones who have finished becoming. They are often the ones who have stopped questioning, which is not the same thing and is in some ways worse. I am more comfortable now in my own uncertainty than I have ever been. I still revise. I still encounter experiences and relationships that shift my understanding of what I value and who I am in relation to the world. I expect to keep doing this until I no longer can. That is not a failure of self-knowledge. It is what self-knowledge actually looks like when it is honest. What I learned: you are not supposed to have arrived by a particular age the sense that everyone else is more settled than you, more certain, more finished. It is almost entirely a projection, a story built from the visible surfaces of other people's lives without access to their interior uncertainty. You are not behind. You are in the middle of becoming, which is where everyone is, at every age, for their entire lives. The work is not to finish. The work is to keep paying attention.
I thought adult friendships were permanent if you wanted them to be. I thought the ones that ended did so because of specific events, a fight, a betrayal, a geographical separation too large to bridge. I thought that if you were a good friend and you chose good friends, then the relationships you built in your 20s would largely be the relationships you carried through your life. Nobody told me about the quiet, undramatic, entirely natural attrition that happens when people grow in different directions and the growing takes them somewhere the friendship cannot follow. My late 20s and early 30s were full of these losses, not dramatic ones. The friend who got married and moved to the suburbs and whose life reorganized itself around a set of priorities that had little overlap with mine. Not because either of us had changed in ways that were wrong, but because the overlap that had made us close had narrowed until there was not enough of it left to build a shared present on. The friend whose politics shifted in ways that made conversation difficult, not in an irreconcilable way, but in a way that required more effort than either of us seemed willing to consistently make. The friend I had been close to through a specific period of shared difficulty who, when the difficulty ended, turned out to have been a companion for that season rather than a permanent presence. Each one of these endings was small. None of them involved a fight or a formal goodbye. They ended in unreturned calls and gradually widening gaps and the specific social awkwardness of two people who were once close, and are now performing a lesser version of that closeness out of loyalty to the history rather than the present. And then one of you stops performing and the friendship becomes something you had rather than something you have. I grieved these losses privately because they felt too minor to name, too undramatic to mention, too gradual to point to as a loss rather than just life happening. There is no ceremony for this kind of ending. No one brings food or sends flowers. You do not get to be sad about it in public because nothing identifiable happened. You just notice, one day, that someone who used to be central is now peripheral, and that the process of their moving there was so quiet you missed it. What I found on the other side of each loss was something I had not expected: the possibility of new friendship built in my 30s with people who matched who I was now rather than who I had been when the earlier friendships formed. These friendships had a different quality than the ones built in youth. They were less accidental, more chosen, built between people who had enough self-knowledge to know what they were looking for and enough history to understand what they were offering. They were harder to build and, because of that, perhaps more durably, themselves. I am in my early 40s now, and my social world looks nothing like it did at 25. Some of the faces are the same and many are different, and I have made a kind of peace with the fluidity that I once mistook for failure. People are companions for seasons as well as for lifetimes, and both are real and both are worth having. And mistaking a seasonal friendship for a permanent one is not a mistake so much as an understandable confusion about how much of this is within our control. What I learned. The friendships that end without drama are not lesser losses for their quietness. Grieve them honestly, even if there is no public language for this particular grief. And then remain open, genuinely, deliberately open, to the people who are arriving, the ones who match who you are now, rather than who you were. They exist. They are looking for you with the same hope you are looking for them. The social world of adulthood is not a closed thing. It keeps offering new people if you keep offering yourself.